Hi, I'm Andy from Adaptronic, and in this video I'm going to tell you about 6 things that an ECU won't do for you. First of all, an ECU doesn't make power, it's a tuning tool. Often people ask me, how many horsepower will this ECU make if I put it on my engine? The answer is the ECU doesn't actually make power itself. The engine makes power, and the more air that you feed through the engine, the bigger bang you can make, and therefore the more power. The only way you can make power on a completely factory engine by putting on an ECU is if the people at the factory actually left power on the table. Normally they don't do this. If it's a turbocharged engine, you can normally increase the boost and make more power that way. But doing so normally means that you're eating into the safety margins that the manufacturer put there. So this may mean that you'll need bigger fuel injectors, stronger ignition system, and eventually even a stronger bottom end on the engine. If you want to make more power, you have to get more air through the engine. And when you make the modifications to do that, you'll need an ECU or some other tuning tool to be able to get the right amount of fuel into the engine for the amount of air that you're now putting in and set fire to it at the right time. Secondly, the ECU won't tune itself for you. A lot of people are very excited about our adaptive tuning function, but you should really think of it as an aid to the tuner or a tool that the tuner uses rather than a way for you to not have to worry about tuning the engine. There are a couple of reasons for this, but one actual big problem. The one big problem is that the enthusiast or the tuner thinks, okay, I don't need to tune the engine anymore, I'll just let the ECU do it. You can't abdicate the tuning of the engine to a piece of hardware because it simply only knows on the engine what's going on based on the sensor inputs that you tell it. So you need to actually take control of tuning the engine. You can use the adaptive tuning to help you, but it's still your responsibility to make sure the tune's correct. The 3 individual problems are, firstly, the ECU can only adjust the current cell that the engine's operating at. If you're at, say, 2000 RPM and 50 kPa manifold pressure, and the ECU sees that the air-fuel ratio is a bit too rich, it can adjust the current cell to make it a bit leaner, but this doesn't give the ECU any information about what's happening at 2000 RPM, at 75 kPa or 100 kPa. So basically, to be able to use it, you need to visit every cell using the adaptive tuning function. This is in particular a problem on high power to weight ratio engines, because if you're trying to tune the full power condition, the engine simply won't spend a lot of time at full throttle at any one RPM. It'll just move through the RPM points too quickly. On my track car, for example, you can only reach full boost at full RPM in about 3rd gear, and even then it'll spin the wheels sometimes. 7,000 RPM in 3rd gear is well beyond the speed limit over here. But also, you probably don't want to be holding the engine at full throttle at 5,000 RPM at 20 pounds of boost while you wait for the ECU to get the mixture correct. The best way to do it is to use the adaptive tuning as a tuning aid to do all the steady state conditions, so cruise and up to about 100 kPa, up to about 4,000 RPM, to tune all those sites on the dyno, and then do power runs for the high power conditions where you don't want to leave the engine at that condition for too long. Lastly, the adaptive fuel tuning only tunes fuel. It doesn't tune ignition timing as well. And ignition timing is really where a lot of the torque is made, and also where you need to be more careful because that's what hurts engines a lot of the time. So to get the best results, you really do need to put it on a dyno and tune both the fuel and the ignition timing. Number 3 thing that the ECU won't do is it won't fix any underlying problems in the car. So this would include volumetric efficiency problems, fuel pressure problems, ignition system problems, and that sort of thing. Sometimes people tell me, I want to put an ECU on my car because I've got a flat spot problem sometimes. Now, if you've actually made modifications to the engine and the factory ECU is not keeping up with the modifications, and that's why you've got the problem, then that's when you need an ECU. But if you've got a relatively standard engine and you haven't done any modifications to it, then you can put an ECU on it and you may be able to tune around the problem, but there may well be an underlying problem which you still need to fix. Having an aftermarket ECU does give you more control than with a factory ECU in a lot of cases, but if there's a fuel pressure problem, you'll still have to fix that before you can tune it. Number 4 thing that the ECU won't do. You can run it in closed loop fuel mode, but that doesn't necessarily save you from a lean out condition. The reason I say this is that if you set up the ECU so it was so responsive to a lean out condition that it would immediately inject enough fuel to compensate, then the mixtures would be so unstable that it would basically be undrivable. So with any practical settings for the closed loop fuel control, it'll simply be too slow to respond to a lean out caused by poor fuel pressure or something like that. In addition, a lot of really highly strung engines can be quite fragile. Rotary engines in particular, so I'm told, can be destroyed very quickly through bad fuel mixtures. One of our customers actually ran their race car out of fuel during qualifying, and according to the logs, it went lean for 1.5 seconds before the fuel pressure ran out. Now, in that time, it actually melted through a spark plug electrode. The spark plug electrode then rattled around the engine and caused further damage. Now, there's no way that in that amount of time that the closed loop function can bring the mixtures back to where they need to be. Number 5 that the ECU won't do for you is it won't save your engine from detonation by being in closed loop ignition mode. The reason for this is that the way that the ECU operates closed loop ignition is by acting on information from the knock sensor. So for the ECU to actually do anything about the ignition timing, it actually has to say knock in the first place. So by the time it's saying knock, you've already had knocking occurring and therefore possibly engine damage. The other reason that you can't rely on closed loop ignition to save the engine is that knock detection is actually a very difficult thing to do. In fact, until recently, a lot of factory ECUs just didn't do any knock detection above about 4,000 RPM, because above about that engine speed, the knock signal gets swamped by the rest of the noise from the engine. It's only more recently, with the advent of DSPs and that sort of thing, that you can actually detect knock reliably above that. Most ECUs don't have that sort of function. The only one of ours that has that function is the 1280, and that function's best described as a crank angle gating on the knock signal input. The human ear is still the best knock detecting function that we have available, and that's why we have a headphone socket on all our ECUs. And the last one that I'd like to talk about is setting up of RPM limits and overboost limits. Plenty of tuners have told me that they don't like using fuel cut for RPM limits and for overboost limits. The reason for this is that if the intake stroke cuts up an injector cycle, then you can have 2 lean cycles rather than 1 correct cycle and then 1 cycle with no fuel at all. This has the potential of causing either high combustion temperatures or knocking, which can then lead to engine damage when it actually goes into fuel cut. So as a result, they often prefer to do ignition cut because it's safer than a fuel cut. Now, this is true in that it's less likely to hurt the engine. However, having fresh charge that's combustible coming straight out of the engine and into very hot exhaust components is not always the safest thing either, in that it can combust in the exhaust system, can combust in the turbocharger, reducing your turbo life. And if you have a street car with a catalytic converter, it will very soon wear out the cat. This is why factory ECUs do fuel cut. But at the same time, they've done so much R&D that they know that they can leave the engine on the rev limiter with the fuel cut function and not hurt the engine. Your tuner does not have the budget to do that with your engine, with your modifications and with his tune. So that's why normally you'd set it up as an ignition cut, but you have to be aware of the other potential dangers. That is, you're getting raw fuel coming out the exhaust. Another note that I'd like to make about boost cuts is that the boost cut can only be cut by the pressure that the ECU sees. So for example, if the hose comes off between the manifold and the ECU or the map sensor, then the ECU can't see the boost and you won't go into boost cut then. Secondly, if your boost limit is set higher than the maximum pressure that's calibrated for the map sensor, then the ECU will never see that pressure, so you'll never go into fuel cut or ignition cut then either.